Anthony, do you know how the third Prime Minister of Canada influenced the name of this show as Drunkard Senators and More, past Prime Ministers of Canada?
I'm assuming it's the second point in the name of the show, which is senators. So Sir John Abbott has the distinction of being the not only the first Canadian-born prime minister, but he's also the first of two senators that become prime minister in the history of Canada.
Exactly. Welcome, heroes and villains, to the Duke Enterprises YouTube channel. Take a moment, relax, stop your bickering, and just enjoy the show. We've discussed in previous episodes, you have a poli-science degree with a specialization with honors in Canadian politics, I believe.
Yep, from the University of the sweatshirt that I'm wearing, Carleton University here from Ottawa, Ontario.
And I'm just a guy that is very interested in the past of Canada. Together, we are putting together this show, which is, as stated in the stinger, called Drunkard Senators and More, Past Canadian Prime Ministers. So, how did Sir John Abbott become Prime Minister if he was a senator? That seems like very abnormal.
So it is abnormal, especially in our current system. Um, so Abbott actually was an MP and a cabinet minister. So he was cabinet minister earlier on. He was the minister. He was actually the Solicitor General of the province of Canada. He was a minister without portfolio between 1887 to 1891, and then he was the president of the Privy Council between 1891 to 1892. Um, so he was actually appointed, so he was a member of parliament, and then he was appointed by Sir John A. Macdonald to the Senate.
That brings up a question that isn't on the list, but you know I typically do this. I go off script quite often in these videos. What is a minister without portfolio? What does that mean?
So in a Canadian context, that can mean one, two things. So it's literally a person who just gets to be called like an honorable minister and gets to sit at the Privy Council while making the decisions with the Prime Minister, or he could be on a special project that isn't named.
The third, fourth, and fifth prime ministers really didn't have a long time to establish themselves as prime ministers. So, in order to understand who they are, we're going to probably talk about who they were before they were prime minister. So, to start that off, is it true that when Abbott was younger, he supported Canada joining the USA?
So he was one of the individuals that signed the annexation manifesto, and that promoted the Canada-U.S. political union. Later in life, when he reflects on it, he does say that joining the United States was no more of a serious idea of seeking annexation with the United States than a prudent child uh, who strikes his nurse has of deliberately murdering her. Uh, he definitely stepped away from that statement later in life. He doesn't come out, but he does pretty much say that he does regret that decision. They had signed this over the fact of the rebellion losses bill, which was introduced and basically had forced compensation to lower Canadians whose property had been destroyed during the rebellions of 1837 to 1838, which was approximately £100,000.
I bet you a lot of people didn't know that Upper and Lower Canada had two separate rebellions. So, you mentioned when we were talking about him at the end of Alexander Mackenzie that he was a lawyer, and I double checked this on Wikipedia, so I assume if you knew he was a lawyer, he was probably a pretty good lawyer, right?
Yeah. So actually, at the time, he was one of the best corporate lawyers in Quebec. Not only was he a good corporate lawyer, he was also a professor of law at McGill, eventually becoming the dean of law at McGill. And during so some of his students were actually would be future prime ministers, like Sir Wilfrid Laurier. At some points in his life, he was considered the richest Canadian.
And you, if I recall, when we were discussing this a while ago, you mentioned that there's schools named after him or something.
Yeah, so in Montreal, there's a cégep named after him, so Sir John Abbott College, or cégep.
So, I'm guessing his military career, which you can find that he had one on Wikipedia, but it doesn't really go into depth on it, wasn't that outstanding.
So, looking into it, he definitely was appointed as a lieutenant colonel of the 100 or of the 11th Argenteuil Battalion, uh, and during this battalion didn't see much action, but it was basically a U.S. Canadian border patrol.
Sir John A. Macdonald's death was sudden, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it was definitely unexpected, uh, and it left a vacuum in leadership at the time.
Did did Abbott want to become prime minister, and if not, who did he want to become prime minister?
So we'll take a step back, and so after McDonald had passed away, the party was actually split between three individuals: John Thompson, who would be a future prime minister, Mackenzie Tupper, and Mackenzie Bowell. So all of these were future prime ministers. But the party was split, and John Thompson definitely was the front runner. But unfortunately, at that time, there was some anti-Roman Catholicism or opinions that were anti-Catholic, and John Thompson was Catholic. And so instead, John Abbott was appointed as prime minister.
Wait, hold up. There were three frontrunners. None of them were Abbott, yet Abbott was chosen?
So he was considered a peacemaker.
Did Abbott want the job?
He most definitely didn't. 12 days before he became prime minister, he had written, "I hate politics and what are considered their appropriate methods. I hate notoriety, public meetings, public speeches, caucuses, and everything that I know of that is apparently the necessary incident of politics, except doing public work to the best of my ability."
Did he? Who was he supporting before he was chosen?
So he had supported Sir John Thompson and believed he should have been the correct choice.
Nixon had to step down because he was impeached. But Abbott seems to just have gone, nope, I'm done with the job, goodbye, and stand down. Is he the only prime minister to have done that?
So actually, he steps down due to failing health, unlike MacDonald, who kind of hid some of his illnesses. Uh, this was he was quite public and upfront about it, and that's why he decided to step down. And then uh, shortly after serving prime minister, because he finished serving in 1892, and then he passed away in 1893. So it was serious. Like he did pass away a year later.
So, Canada's third Prime Minister, if I understand this correct, learned from his past mistakes and was an amazing corporate lawyer, but did not want to be Prime Minister at all.
He did not, but while he was prime minister, he was quite popular. There were quite a few by-elections during his short run as prime minister, and he actually increased the conservative majority. So he also did start talks with the United States on a reciprocity treaty. I can never say that word correctly. Reciprocity treaty with the United States.
Depending on how one defines a scandal, the next scandal that happens in Canada politics could be the Manitoba school crisis. Did that start with Abbott?
So the Manitoba schools question did start at the tail end of Abbott's rule, um, and it this question definitely does end up splitting not only, well, I guess along linguistic but also along ethnic lines, um, and definitely starts a period in Canadian politics that leads to the end of conservative rule in Canada for the foreseeable future. Because we'll have our very quick prime ministers, the next few, and then we'll end on Laurier. And Laurier ends up being prime minister of Canada for quite some time and leads an interesting legacy.
As I may or may not have already mentioned, the next few prime ministers are going to be a lot like this one, where we talk about who they were before they became prime ministers, because they don't have that long of time in prime ministers. But we're also going to touch on how each one dealt with the Manitoba school question, if at all.
Yeah, so that makes sense. That seems to be the correct approach. And then we can focus on things that they did either um, at the provincial or like within the House of Commons. Our next prime minister is also a premier of the province of Nova Scotia.
Join us next time where we go over another prime minister with the name John.
Yeah, so it's 3 Johns in a row. Well, not well if you take out 3 conservative Johns in a row.